Trevon Brazile has decided to return to college. Will that magic Coach Cal pitch make him the lone returning Razorback?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, what's up? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoops show out there. Happy Tuesday to all of you. You're joining us at the place to get your college basketball content every single day. We're your hosts. This guy is Andy Patton, back from some disc golf over the Memorial Day weekend. And I'm Isaac Schade. Man, we're glad to be with you. Thanks for making us your first listen or watch. As always, we want to remind you that you can catch every episode. What's an episode, Andy? That's when you eat appetizers from Applebee's while you record. Anyway, every episode you can find ad-free on Amazon Music. Special shout out to all of you everydayers out there, as well as all the members of the Locked On College Basketball Discord. We're so glad you're all here. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Andy, coming up on the show today, we are going to talk about Trevon Brazile's decision to come back. We're going to try to figure out why so many guys are taking so long to make their NBA draft decision to stay in or pull out. Feels like more than normal. And Andy, we say goodbye. We say RIP to an actual legend, a literal larger-than-life personality from our sport in Bill Walton. So, Andy, as we get into this, it is Tuesday. That means tomorrow, Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time is the early entry withdrawal deadline. Players have to make a decision by that point, or they're in the NBA draft and cannot come back to school. So one such player who made that decision that was reported on Memorial Day was Trevon Brazile, that has played 3 years, started at Mizzou, and then has played the last 2 years at Arkansas, although had that unfortunate ACL injury in his sophomore year, his first year at Arkansas. So actually has 2 years of eligibility left. Andy, is this the right decision for Trevon Brazile, do you think?
Yeah, I do. I think, coming off the injury, and I think you saw a Trevon Brazile last year that probably wasn't quite at the level that most believe he's capable of. And I think you don't want to, even in a weak draft class, and I think we'll talk more about the weak draft class element of all of this later in the show, but I think you want to be able to put your best foot forward. And I think Brazile has better basketball to be played. He can showcase more of the athleticism that I think is really going to be the selling point for him as an NBA player. And in an era where youth still matters, and every year that you get older, every year that there's a different age next to your name when you're in the draft process is going to be a little bit of a knock, but it hasn't been as big of a knock lately. I think we're seeing more NBA teams starting to prioritize getting guys who are more NBA ready. We're seeing, recent draft picks like Jaime Jaquez or Brandon Pajemski, or some older like Corey Kispert was a 4-year guy. Desmond Bane was a 4-year guy. Like, we're seeing more of these 4, even 5-year guys getting drafted and teams kind of prioritizing that. So I think age isn't as big of a concern, and I would rather be able to have played my best basketball. And I don't think Trevon Brazile was good last year, but I don't think that was his best basketball. And I think you look at a player who's coming off of that kind of injury, it sometimes takes a lot of time. And you made a comparison to, very unfortunately, recently, Ronald Acuna for the Atlanta Braves, who just tore his ACL again, or tore a different ACL this time. But last time when it happened, the whole next year after coming off that injury, he was good, but you kind of felt like he was still finding himself. The year after that, he wins an MVP. So, like, ACL injuries take time, and especially in basketball where there's a lot of lateral mobility, like, it is a hard injury to recover from. So the fact that Brazile was effective at all last year, he averaged about 8.5 points, 6 boards, a little over a block a game, shot well from 3. Like, the fact that he did that last year proves that he's already at that level. He's already a capable NBA type of player, but I think there's more in the tank. And I think coming back to school, finding the right situation, whether that is going back to Arkansas under Coach Calipari, whether that is some other high-profile programs that I think could and should make a run at Brazile in the transfer portal, I think if he finds the right spot and he truly is at or near 100% for the full season, he will do enough to boost his draft stock, even going into what is expected to be a better draft class in 2025.
Yeah, Andy, I'm right with you. I think remembering back to those first 9 games that he did play in the 2022-23 season, that Trevon Brazile was awesome.
Yeah.
Right. And so if he's back to that now, and by the time this season starts, it will almost have been a full 2 years, because it was December something of 22 when he had that injury. And so to me, like, look out, because this year could be a blow up year for Trevon Brazile, whoever it is that gets him, by the way. And according to Jeff Goodman, who I think was the first person that was out with this, right, Andy, said he's wide open looking for his next school, was the quote on his tweet. So, Andy, before we get wide open to the 360-ish Division I teams, I think we got to start with the idea of him returning to Fayetteville. As of right now, Arkansas has literally no players that were on last year's team. We don't need to relitigate this a ton, because I talked about it yesterday on Monday's show with the DJ Wagner commitment. But right now, Arkansas has 8 scholarship players, 6 of which are players that 3 of whom were at Kentucky last year. That's DJ Wagner's, Vonimir Ivisic, and who am I leaving out?
Adu Thiero.
Thank you. And then 3 that were in the incoming freshman class at Kentucky that have come with Coach Cal. That's Billy Richmond, Carter Knox, and Boogie Fland. Good grief. It's Memorial Day, and we're all struggling with names here. Well, I am anyway. Andy's not. And then, you do have 2 others in addition to that, in Jonell Davis coming from FAU and Jonas Adu coming from Tennessee. But Andy, outside of that, it feels like it would be really helpful for Coach Cal and this program if they could land somebody that was in it last year to help kind of bridge the gap.
I think so. And I think he's the kind of player that I think would fit well just in terms of what this roster needs from a construction perspective. Like, he's 6'10" and he can stretch the floor. And I know the volume of 3-point shooting hasn't really been there for Brazile. And I think that there's maybe some, like, is that really going to be something that translates in a major way? But again, we talk about those 9 games, and it's hard to glean too much from a 9-game sample size, but he shot 38% from 3, basically 37.9 on 3.2 attempts per game. Right. Last year, he took less attempts and he still shot 35%, which is still good, but it was only 2.6 attempts per game. If you buy that he could be a guy who knocks down 37, 38, 40% of his threes while taking 3 to 3.5 per game, that would be really huge in an offense with Jonas Adu, who's not really doing that, and with some guards who, DJ Wagner's notoriously not a great 3-point shooter. Like, that's not an area that he adds to this team. So Calipari has been very slow to kind of, start the 3-point movement. But if he wants to bring it with Arkansas, because last year he finally started doing it with Dillingham and Shepard and some of the guys they had at Kentucky. Like, I think Brazile's the right player to bring in to be able to space the floor a little bit, give them some athleticism. I know they have Zvonimir Ivisic, and I know that there's an expectation that he can play a big role. I see him more as a backup 5 to Adu. I don't know that you play Adu and Ivisic together a ton. And right now, look, the roster construction would probably have them both starting if they don't make any other additions. Or you could start Thiero at the 4. He's just kind of small for that role, and your spacing is going to be a bit of an issue. So I think Brazile not only makes sense returning to Arkansas just for the, just going back to the same school type of factor, but I think it makes sense from a roster construction perspective in terms of what Coach Calipari needs on this team. So I would love to see him go make a run at him and see if he can get him back on campus with a different coach, because I think the fit is there.
Well, and Andy, you talked about that 3-point shooting. I wouldn't be surprised at all if some of the NBA feedback he got was, absolutely, we need you to prove that your 3-point shot is legitimate and consistent, because that's what you're going to have to do as a stretch 4 in this league. And also, we need you to go back to school and prove to us that you're the athlete you were before this injury. And so what does that mean? That means Brazile is working on that 3-point shot like a crazy man this summer, Andy. And so I think that's a great point to question it, but I think that's going to be a big focus for him, is getting all of that athleticism back, strengthening the knee, continuing to strengthen it at least, and really getting in on that 3-point shot. Andy, I think I'm with you. I think he would fit beautifully with this team and would be a massive addition. And you know that the Hog Nation would love it as well, getting Brazile back. Andy, what about, again, it's wide open. I know we can't just go through everybody and everyone and think about who needs an awesome power forward, but this dude's going to play at the high major level, right? So there's only a couple conferences we're probably even considering. Just who are some teams, maybe just 2-3 teams that jump out at you as like, oh, that's a landing spot?
The first team that came to my mind was Texas, and the Texas lose. Dylan Dessou's gone. They lose Dylan Mitchell. He transfers to Cincinnati, and I feel like they could use a player of this ilk, somebody to come in who can do some scoring and do some floor spacing with Caden Shedrick, who's not really much of an offensive threat for Rodney Terry's team. Like, they're moving into the SEC, so he'd get an opportunity to compete against against Arkansas and against Kentucky and some of those teams that he's already kind of played against in his past. And I don't know. I think Texas makes a lot of sense if they were to reach out here. I could see them being invested in potentially somebody like Arthur Kalumo if he returns from the draft process as well. And then I'll toss out North Carolina too, a team that obviously has been kind of the focus for Carolina this offseason, has been replacing Armando Bacot, and they go out and they add Van Allen Lubin from Vanderbilt as kind of the pseudo replacement there. But I think they're still looking for some more oomph. They also lose Harrison Ingram to the draft, and I think they could use like a 4 who can do a little bit more than just be a tough-nosed rebounder type. And I think for Brazile to come into that system, be able to space the floor a little bit, create some more driving lanes for RJ Davis, I think that could work kind of in that Ingram-esque role for Hubert Davis's team as well.
Yeah, Andy, very interesting stuff there. And I mean, goodness, who knows? Again, there's all these different possibilities out there, so we'll see. Andy, I'll just mention quickly because I know we need to move on, but Javian McCollum from Oklahoma State is also pulling out of the draft, and he's going to be at Georgia Tech. That's good news for Damon Stoudemire, who has lost his leading scorer, Miles Kelly, and so we'll see what happens there in Atlanta.
Well, Isaac, a couple other college stars, did return to school, but there's the main conversation here is how many who have not. We're still, as we're recording this right now, there's still so many players who have not made up their mind or haven't announced publicly what decision they're making. And we want to talk about why that is. And we're going to get to that in just a second. Right after I tell you about today's sponsor, FanDuel. Folks, it's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. And tonight is Game 4 of the Western Conference Finals between the Dallas Mavericks and the Minnesota Timberwolves. Dallas currently favored by 2. Will they pick up the victory and the sweep to move to the championship? It is worth taking a gamble on. If you agree, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, Isaac, continuing our conversation about the NBA draft deadline as it is coming up here on Wednesday evening, talking about players who are going to stay in the draft process, coming back to college. It kind of feels like another start of an offseason. Like there's going to be a handful of players who we'll talk about who, if they do choose to return to school, like Brazile, who have the opportunity to then kind of create this new like free agency period because they're in the transfer portal. Brazile's going to be heavily pursued. And there's a handful of other guys who are in the portal who are also still in the draft process who are going to be heavily pursued as well. And what's fascinating is we made a list, I think it was on Friday's episode, of 10 players who are not in the transfer portal, but who are in the draft process. And then we made a list of 7 and we added a couple more. So now we have 9 players who are in the portal and in the draft process. This was like 4 days ago as we're recording this. Isaac, only 2 of the 19 players that are on this list have actually made their decisions. We already talked about Brazile. The other one is Walter Clayton, who is returning to Florida. I'd like to talk a little bit about that and what it means for Todd Golden's team. But mostly the conversation here is that we're not very far away from this deadline. And there's still a whole bunch of players, really good players, who we don't really know. We don't know where they're going to play next year.
Yeah, Andy, it's pretty wild. And unless I missed it and you said it, let me timestamp this for us. We're recording on Monday night around 10 p.m. Eastern time. So if you're listening to this on Tuesday and a whole host of people have already said something, it's because we're recording this on Monday. But Andy, I mean, we're talking about like Mark Sears, Caleb Love, Alex Caravan, Johnny Furphy, Hunter South, like all of these names that it's like, why haven't you made a decision yet? You and I, Andy, were talking about before we started recording, like, we haven't gone back through it and looked at timelines of when guys decided in past years, but it just feels like there are more big names on the board that are yet to make decisions. Andy, I've thought of two different reasons of why it is. I'm curious if you think there's any merit to these and if you have any of your own. Number one, I'm wondering if because of the perception of this as a weak draft, that if some of these guys that otherwise would have already looked at it and said, there's no snowball's chance in Arizona that I'm going to get drafted here, if because of the weaker draft, if they're like, this might be worth me sticking around longer to see if I can get some sort of guarantee or commitment from a team, even if it's second round and it's not a guaranteed contract, a guarantee of getting drafted. So there might be something to that. Another part of it is just with the whole Memorial Day weekend of it all. I'm wondering if, like, on Monday, we expected to hear a bunch of stuff and it's like, we just didn't. And it's because it's a holiday. I'm wondering if today, Tuesday, and even into tomorrow, the actual deadline day, if these will just come flood. I mean, they're going to have to come flooding in, but if we're going to hear a lot more on Tuesday as we get back to the office, as it were.
Yeah, and I think I think the transfer portal and the NIL aspect of it, they're always going to be things that kind of change the narrative about how this has been done historically, because there's such dramatic shifts to the sport. And I think NIL in particular feels like it's playing a huge role here in guys who maybe in the past wouldn't even really consider returning to school, like guys who would be like, hey, I'm for sure out, I'm done. But, at this point, you're like, I'm like a lot of these guys feel like they're players who are somewhat capped in terms of their ability to return to school and dramatically improved their draft stock. Like, with no disrespect to Caleb Love or Mark Sears in particular, like they're not guys who are going to dramatically improve their draft stock coming. Like there's not really anything they could do next year at Arizona and Alabama respectively that would increase their draft stock, at least not more than them being a year older would kind of, even it out. But I think that for them, it's like you could just go pro and say, all right, I'm done with college. I'm not going to be able to return to school and necessarily improve my draft stock. So I'm just going to go pro and whatever happens, happens. But also it's like, well, I could go back to college and maybe my draft stock doesn't improve, but I can get $2 million and be the big man on campus and, lead a team, if you're Love, lead a team into the Big 12. If you're Sears, lead a team, hopefully back to the Final Four like they did last year. Like those were always appealing, reasons to return to school. But that plus $1.5 million is a little bit different than it was, 3, 5, 10, 15 years ago. So I feel like there's no way that that's not playing some role. And for the guys in the portal, it's like, if you're Jackson Robinson and you're like, okay, I could stay in the draft, I could come back to school and go to the highest bidder and, see if I can drive my old coach, Mark Pope, to give me over $1 million to go play for him, or if BYU will pony up some cash, or if somebody else will get involved in the mix too. Like those guys have an unlimited amount of options. And I think, frankly, the more options you have, the more paralyzing it is to actually make a decision. And so I think for some of those guys, it's as simple as like, it's just hard. It's hard to make a decision, and it's hard to know, like, hey, maybe I'm not going to get drafted, but I could get a 2-way contract, or I could fulfill my lifelong dream of playing in the NBA or playing professional basketball, but I could also return to school. 300 different schools are going to want me. They're going to have a bidding war. Like that's an appealing thing to have to consider. So I think there's that plus everything you said with the holiday and with the weaker draft class. I think it's kind of a confluence of factors that have led to what I agree feels like a large, very dynamic group of athletes that are still kind of up in the air right now in terms of where they're going to be next year.
Yeah, Andy, and I like what you're saying there with the NIL stuff, because, there's that age-old question of like, what else is there left for him to do in college? Mm-hmm. Well, in this day and age, the answer to that goes beyond team accolades to saying what else is there left for him to do in college? Set up his family for the rest of his life.
Exactly.
Because this might be the best earning power a player of a certain capped ability, as you said, has. And so if I'm one of these dudes, and if I'm Mark Sears, And I'm never really going to be, I don't know what his NBA ceiling is, but if this is the lone time in his life where he could make $2 million, then dadgummit, let me set up myself and potentially generations of my family. And go back to Tuscaloosa where it's awesome. And like just play for a great coach and a fun team. Like it just makes a ton of sense to me. Andy, quickly, you said, let's talk a little bit about Walter Clayton before we move on. I just think the big thing here, and I talked about this some on Monday's show with Will Richard already coming back, but you pair those two guys with FAU transfer Elijah Martin. And Andy, how about this? Here's a stat that I had seen. I had kind of not seen, but like put together earlier on Monday. All three of these guys made 70 or more three-pointers last year. You use the term nasty for the potential of this backcourt. What do you like about what Todd Golden has with this trio?
Todd Golden is a guard whisperer. He was a guard whisperer at San Francisco when he turned Jamari Bouye into an NBA player, when he turned Central Washington D2 player Khalil Shabazz into one of the most prolific scorers in Don's history. Like this man has an incredible ability to develop guards. And we've seen it with Elijah Martin obviously hasn't played there yet, but he's going to be fantastic in that system. Will Richard's going to be excellent again. He already has been. And Walter Clayton turned in a phenomenal season last year after transferring in from Iona. Like this team is going to be fantastic. They're going to space the floor. I like Alex Condon as their big. We'll see when Micah Handlogton's back from his injury, but Condon can space the floor. Like this team's going to be out wide. They're going to be a difficult defensive assignment for every team in the conference. We'll see how they are defensively. That's going to be a big question mark for this program, especially with Handlogton on the shelf. He was a good shot blocker for them, but I love this backcourt. I love adding Elijah Martin to the mix. I love getting these two guys back. I think this is going to be one of the most fun teams to watch in the SEC and honestly, potentially in the NCAA. I don't know if I'm not necessarily saying they're going to be great. I still have concerns about their defense, but man, I think they're going to be fun.
They will be. And in an SEC, I mean, you think about some of these other SEC backcourts that they'll go up against, man. That's just going to be legit. Also, by the way, the reason I picked that 70 three-pointers made kind of threshold is because both Will Richard and Elijah Martin made exactly 70 last year, Andy. So there you go. That's where that stat comes from. Now, Andy, unfortunately, on Memorial Day, as we were remembering those who have died to keep us safe and protect us in this country, one of the biggest names and biggest dudes in our sport, Bill Walton, and most polarizing broadcasters, passed away at the age of 71 after a long battle with cancer. We're going to discuss his legacy and how he'll be remembered coming up in just a second. Andy, Bill Walton, one of just 4 players in college basketball history to win 3 National Player of the Year awards. For those of you who are younger and might only know Bill Walton, the announcer, this dude was an absolute stud of a basketball player. Andy, I know, you are from the Pacific Northwest up there in Pac-12 country, the Conference of Champions, of whom this man loved that conference so dearly. Just want to give you the ball and let you run with it a little bit here, thinking about Bill Walton and his legacy.
Yeah, I'm a Portland native. I grew up just outside of Portland. So Bill Walton was kind of for lack of a better term, larger than life personality. Well before I even knew him as a broadcaster, I knew him as one of the most iconic players in Portland history. Obviously, Clyde Drexler and Bill Walton, those were the names. Those were the players that I grew up hearing about from my dad, from like family members who were Blazers fans. So I've kind of had Bill Walton as this like larger than life figure in my head since I was literally a toddler. And to now be in a position where I got to see him in this different light as a broadcaster. I watched his, late night games. He called a lot of Gonzaga games. So I've seen him a lot. He called obviously tons of Pac-12 games, seen him call UCLA, USC games, Oregon games, all sorts of different contests. And I've been trying to figure out why this has been very impactful for me. And I think there's a lot of reasons. I think obviously Bill Walton's somebody I'm closely connected to with like my dad and my family. And so I think that is part of it. But I also think like it's hard to lose people who are so unique. Like Bill Walton's not just great. Like he is great. And like Bill Russell, was great. And Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who is still with us, but obviously when he's not, like he's great too. But Bill Walton was just different. Like he was just so unique. And I think that it's hard to lose unique figures. especially in sports where a lot of figures they don't all blend together. They're all unique in their own way, but they're rarely this unique. And I think that's what makes this so, like, I like knowing how Bill Walton thinks about things. I like seeing him analyze things. And I know people didn't always he was not everybody's cup of tea, cup of very green tea for everybody. He wasn't. I get that. As a broadcaster, he went off script and he, was goofy. He also never took himself too seriously. And I think that's why he endeared himself to a lot of people, is they liked that about him. They liked that he knew he was being goofy, that he knew he was talking about, the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains during a basketball game. And I know that alienated people, but it was kind of soothing in a way. Like, he was just so authentically himself. And Bill is somebody who you could really easily frame his life as a tragedy. His career was cut short by injuries. He had his relationship with Portland was very tenuous. He sued the team for medical malpractice after he left. He won them an NBA championship. Isaac, his stats in the NBA finals against the Philadelphia 76ers, by the way, he averaged 18.5 points and 19 rebounds per game. He also averaged 5.5 assists and 3 blocks. The man was an unbelievable basketball player in his prime. He just was not very long because of chronic knee injuries and foot injuries and issues that he had. And then he sued the team, and he had this tenuous relationship with the city of Portland, despite bringing them their first and still only NBA championship. He had some serious mental health issues at times. He was in chronic pain. And you could paint his story as a tragedy. You could paint the fact that he died a day after the death of the Pac-12 as a tragedy. I think Bill would probably would want that to be portrayed in a comedic way. I don't think he would want that to come across sad. That's not who he was. It is kind of sad. And it's also serendipitous and kind of poetic in some ways that the final game of the Pac-12 regular season, that epic baseball game between USC and Arizona, was 24 hours-ish before his life ended. And I think that is poetic. And I think that's how he would want to see it. So I'm going to choose to view it that way as opposed to viewing it as a sad thing, because I don't think Bill Walton wanted anybody to be sad. He made that very clear, the way that he interacted with people in person, on video, in broadcast, whatever. He wanted people to be happy. He wanted to make people happy. And I think that's the best way to look at it, because this is sad and it's hard, because he's somebody that I think a lot of people really cared about. And I think really enjoyed and valued his opinion. And it's hard to lose somebody like that, but that's not how he would want us to feel. So let's celebrate the good times with Bill Walton, because he was truly one of a kind.
Andy, yeah, I mean, good grief. Thank you also for sharing those kind of personal anecdotes and stories about him. I think that's what really cements it. I love that, as big of a physical human being as he was, as you said, the only thing that dwarfs that is his personality and the human that he was. I had the privilege to encounter him once at the 2022 Final Four in New Orleans. And I mean, we didn't share a conversation or anything, but walked past him and got to say hi. But when I say I walked past him, it was, I'm looking up, staring up into the stratosphere. I mean, because he is just, even that, I guess 69 years old at that point, was so massively huge and so larger than life, physically and metaphorically. And so I really love that. But Andy, I think, all the basketball accolades, both in our side of things on college and in the NBA, at the end of the day, Andy, I just think it's one of those things that I love how he celebrated life, how he honored and celebrated others. I loved watching, almost in like a Dickie V sort of way, how he would just celebrate the players he was commentating on. He saw the best in people. I loved, like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, you talked about him earlier, posted a picture of the two of them on Monday. And it's like, if you don't have any reference to anyone else, so they just look like normal sized humans, when really they're these two massive, 7-foot-ish men. And so I just love how he helped show people how to honor others well and celebrate them well, both on the court and just in life. And Andy, at the end of the day, our achievements, our accolades, the money we made, none of that's ultimately going to matter. When I'm dead and gone, did I love people well? Did I make people put them in a better spot in life than before they met me. And Andy, I think Bill Walton did exactly that, a life well lived. And so, Andy, I'll say, and then I'll let you have the final word on Bill Walton here. Thank you, Bill, for your life.
Yeah, I wanted to end it here with a quote that my dad sent me as a quote from Bill Walton. It was from his biography. I know a couple other outlets have used this quote as well in their articles, but I thought it was fantastic. He said, quote, "When I was 28, I learned how to speak. It's become my greatest accomplishment of my life and everybody else's biggest nightmare." And I just love that he somehow found a way to phrase that in a way that's humorous and also kind of poetic and incredibly prophetic in terms of how his career ended as a broadcaster. So again, thank you, Bill. Loved watching your career, loved being a part of it as somebody from Portland, and rest in peace. Best way we can end it there. That is going to wrap it up for us today, though, here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. We're going to be back the rest of the week, continuing to keep coverage on this NBA draft deadline, who's staying, who's going, who's going to be in the transfer portal, what that's going to look like. All of that coming your way this week here on Locked On College Basketball. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you have not done so already, and go find that link in the show notes to join us on our Discord channel, where we'll be reacting live to all of these different announcements coming your way. Thanks again for listening. Apologies to the Lawyer family. Let's go Wildcats. And until tomorrow, in true Bill Walton fashion, peace out.